Good evening. Welcome to another edition of Auckland Deep Thinkers in close cooperation with Rock the Vote. Tonight we're on part 2 of our seminar series on behavioural psychology, and tonight we'll be looking at understanding our behaviour. So the contents for tonight, we'll be looking at what drives our behaviour, the 3 layers of the mind, reason versus emotion, perceptions versus reality, and the banality of evil. And we'll finish off with the elephant in the room. But before we get started, a disclaimer: I'm not a psychologist. I'm an engineer and I'm trying to work out what's going on. And as part of tonight's events and the other events, I'd like your feedback. Tell me what you think, whether it's on the right track or whether you disagree. And what I'm trying to find out is, why do people believe what they believe, in spite of obvious contradictions, and in some cases, holding ideas which are clearly insane? How did we get here? So that was the subject of the first seminar, Are We Being Manipulated? Why do people behave as they do? So that's tonight's seminar on understanding our behaviour. And then finally, in 2 weeks' time, we'll look at where do we go from here? And it's how to have difficult conversations. So the background and inspiration, a reminder again. So this was derived from an online course I did over the holidays from Reaching People, and you can find that by reachingpeople.net. And that's led by David Charalambous of the UK. And I started making notes, and the notes I made I thought would make a good seminar. But then I expanded further and it ended up as 3 sessions, also inspired by Peter Boghossian and also James Lindsay. And Peter Boghossian, as you may know, has written a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations. And he raises the same sort of questions. Why do people believe things which are quite clearly insane? And James Lindsay does a good explanation of where we have come from and how did we get here. There are other references, as will pop in as we go, including tonight's is Dan Early. And the trouble with humans, well, the basic insight is that our behaviour is not guided by perfect logic. It's not a supercomputer that we can analyse the cost benefits of every action. Instead, it's led by our very human, sociable, emotional, and sometimes fallible brain. We are predictably irrational. We're prone to reliable misjudgments. So that sets the scene of trying to understand our behaviour. Now, to know where we're going from and going to, here's a reference from Rudyard Kipling. He says, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and where and when and how and why and who. And with this context and this background, we'll take you through understanding behaviour. So let's begin at the top. What drives our behaviour? So to understand our behaviour, you need to understand people's thinking. To understand people's thinking, you need to understand their beliefs, what they believe. To understand their beliefs, you need to know where they've come from and understand how they identify. So let's take it from the top, because we start with the purpose. And this can come down to your faith, your religion, your purpose, or even just the bigger picture. And this is your place in the world. Then we look at the who. How do you identify and the roles we play, what you believe about yourself? So that's the I am. And then you look at the why. And that comes to your values and beliefs, why we believe and hold what is important to us. So that's the motivation. The how? Well, we have skills and abilities, competence and knowledge. And then we do the what. And that results in our behaviour, the behaviours that we demonstrate. And that goes through our thought processes and then our physical action. So we've come down from the top, and finally we get to the where and when. So that's the environment, so the location and context. And that's the results and the outcome. So what we're normally faced with is the results and the outcome of people's behaviour. But to trace where that has come from, you go back to their thought processes and you go back to their competence and their knowledge and what motivates them and where they believe they are in the world. Now, here's a nice big graph and nice picture. And this is AQUAL, also known as all quadrants and all levels. And this was developed by Ken Wilber. And this was recommended to me by a friend. And it's very, very complicated, although kudos to Ken for producing an awful lot of information on a single page. I won't go through the whole lot because it's very complicated, but I will dwell on a couple of sideshows. In particular, the quadrants. And he divides up our behaviour and our view and the reasons for our behaviour in terms of the individual versus the group and the interior versus the exterior. So over here on the top left, we've got our self, we've got our consciousness, and potentially our spirituality, our purpose, our value, and so on. So this is the singular, and this is inward looking. If we go to the group, we're looking at the we. So this is the plural, and this is your cultural values, as it were, and possibly your political values and what values your community holds. If you take that on the exterior, and again, you're looking at the singular, you're looking at the individual. So this can be the hard sciences like the physics, the biology and chemistry, just the facts about it. Now, if we take that as a group and the exterior, you're looking at social systems, the wider world and how we all fit into that. And this has been the topic of interest for a number of philosophers, not least of which was Karl Marx. And we'll come back to him later. So he also goes into the stages of development. Now, I won't go into them all, but he puts it in a way of progression, and that we're growing up. We go from birth as our instinctive self. We are just trying to survive, and you do what you must to survive. You scavenge whatever you need. So this is quite primitive. If we mature a little bit more, we get to our animistic self, and you're looking at the tribal order. So you might want to keep the spirits happy and the tribe's nest warm and safe. So you're looking at magical thinking, and you're petitioning to gods and so on. So mature a little bit more, and you're into the early mythic or feudal or even exploitative empires. And Ken thinks this started around 10,000 years ago. So might makes right. You be and do what you want regardless. So you align with power. So if you don't have power, you need to align with power. And you take what you need, even by force if necessary. Of course, the downside of that is oppression, gangs, depression, terrorism, and so on. Well, let's mature a bit further, and you're looking at nation states in the rule-based or role self. The danger is it can be authoritarian, and you can have absolutist religions. It can be ethnocentric, but this gives your life meaning, direction, and purpose. And this purpose is given to you from your community or the nation state you're living in. And that can give you a predetermined outcome. That's a benefit, but it's also a pitfall because you can fall into the archetypal role identification. So that you were born poor, you will always stay poor. If you're born a carpenter or to a carpenter's family, you will always stay a carpenter. Then we move on and we mature a little bit more and we achieve our rational self. And this fits in with capitalistic democracies, which started over 300 years ago. And this is where you're looking at scientific rationalism and a world-centered view. So you're still acting from self-interest, but you're playing the game to win. There's a market-driven meritocracy, and what you seek is the truth. The downside, well, belief in science can end up being scientism. And roles can be confused. Instead of having predetermined roles in society, the roles are confused. Now, if we move ahead and we mature a little bit more, we get onto our sensitive self. This is what Ken Wilber described as social democracies, and starting 150 years ago. Now, I don't always agree with what Ken's saying in here, but the quest is for peace, affectionate relationships, and beneficial resolution. So it's often down to the I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So it's mutually beneficial society, protecting the weak and living, as Ken describes, in harmony. The downside, of course, the pitfall is nihilism, inauthenticity, and excessive relativism, which we'll see in a bit later. So those are the first tier of his stages of development. I won't go into the second tier because it gets very idealistic and possibly utopian. But you can see that the development of the personality can follow these 6 steps. And in some cases, people are basically very primitive, and in other cases, they're very rational. And there's obviously going to be a conflict between those 2 groups of people. So let's discuss the differences between reason and emotion. So on our left, we have Immanuel Kant, and he came up with a very long book which said, do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And similarly, don't do wrong things because they are wrong. And he expected people to come to this conclusion through rational thought. So any reasonable person would come to this conclusion, and then life would be good. However, as Professor Steve Peters has pointed out, people are not reasonable, and they're definitely not rational. And so he's written a book called The Chimp Paradox. And so our decisions and our behavior is often driven by that chimp that lives inside us, and that's running on emotion. Emotions run significantly faster than our reasoning mind. So let's see where Kant got to by looking at this family tree of Germanic philosophers. And I've got James Lindsay to thank for this. And if you follow it down, well, one of his pupils was Hegel, and he came up with a Hegelian dialectic, which was turned into the materialist dialectic by Karl Marx. And of course, he was the inspiration for Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, which of course led to the Red Terror, the gulags, and the Cultural Revolution. And of course, in all 3 cases, millions dead. Well, let's look at another branch. There's Schopenhauer there, and he was an inspiration for Nietzsche, who of course was Adolf Hitler's favorite philosopher. And so naturally, as you're probably aware, that he led to the final solution and millions dead. How did we get here? Yes, this was a real headline. Gulags were compassionate educational institutions, say trans rights campaigners. Yeah, I think somebody missed the memo here. How did we get here? So thanks again to James Lindsay on this one. Let's look at that family tree again. So we went from Germanic philosophers, now we're looking at a few French philosophers, and bearing in mind that nearly all bad ideas come from France. So let's look at Derrida, and he was a good follower of Marx, and Foucault was a good follower of Nietzsche, but both derived from both Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche in their thinking. And Derrida and Foucault were one of the acolytes, not just the only ones, but 2 of the guiding lights of the postmodernist movement. And they looked at deconstructivism, relativism, and the postmodernist. Now, many postmodernists will deny that they're relativists, but if you look at what they're producing, for example, that mental illness is a social construct, then you'll realize that they are relativists. And this is relativists in terms of cultural relativism and moral relativism and even ethical relativism. So that school of thought led to things like critical race theory, which led to Black Lives Matter, and fiery but mostly peaceful protests. It also led to critical feminist theory, which led to a lot of miserable women, and critical gender theory, which led to our gender unicorn there and led to butchery of children. Now, this is one of the nicer pictures I could post on here. Some of the other details of gender transition surgery are downright horrific. So the clue is if it's got critical in it and it's a theory, then it's probably come from postmodernism, and it's probably derived somewhere from a Marx-based background. So we come to the banality of evil. Now, this is based from Dr. Robert Malone, who gave a lecture last year, and he described the situation that we've been living under. He said, what has really occurred over the last 4 years and what is occurring now, I think we have the interaction of 3 major forces. One is just gross incompetence. The second is nefarious scheming. The third is the complexity of the systems. Now, at the intersection of these things, we have a number of other phenomena that emerge. At the intersection between incompetence and complex systems, we have arbitrary bureaucracy. At the interface of incompetence and nefarious scheming, we have unanticipated consequences. And at the interface of nefarious scheming and complex systems, we have corruption. And right at the middle of it, we have the banality of evil. He didn't draw it, but what he described was a Venn diagram. And who doesn't like a Venn diagram? So let's draw it. So we have gross incompetence, we have nefarious scheming, we have complex systems. You put them together, what happens on the interfaces? We have arbitrary bureaucracy, you have corruption, and you have unanticipated consequences. And these combine together to give you the situations we've had in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. And that's known as the banality of evil. How could such things happen? An awful lot of evil was created effectively by civil servants following rules. Coming back to behaviour, well, behaviour is often driven by perceptions, and our perceptions are quite different from reality. In my PhD viva, I was asked about, is there such a thing as the real world? And it was in the context of computer modelling, and we were trying to model things in the real world in a computer system. And I said, well, not entirely, because what we really have are interpretations of perceptions of the environment around you. Now that sounds a bit far out, but it's how we view the world, and we all view the world in a different way. Our perception is not the same as reality. Our perception, my perception, may be different from yours. The first thing we have is an anchor bias. So those first impressions count. So what you learned as a child sticks with you, and what you learned, the behavior you learned as a child from your peers has a big influence. We also edit in real time, but the outsiders have very little control over that. And we have filters. Sometimes they get updated, sometimes they don't. It does beg the question as, do people join groups because they share the same beliefs, or do they share the same beliefs because they are part of that group? Is it cause or effect, or is it the other way around? We look through our own lenses, so we see what effectively we want to see. It's like we're living in a Truman Show, and the perceptions of our world dictate the view of reality. Remember the influence factors we talked about in seminar 1? Those are the keys for giving you the meaning and interpreting what things mean. There's also a very powerful thing called a story, and stories often rule societies. Now, to give the example of the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, and this was quite influential on the development of the civil rights movement in the US, which is now rather ironic as it's now seen as a problematic book given its context and language. Stories kind of rule civilization and rule the development of society. And you may not be a churchgoer, but you've probably heard of the Good Samaritan, and you may have heard of the prodigal son. You know those stories because they're part of our civilization, and they're very powerful. So we see the world not as it is, but as we are. So we are a big influence on how we interpret the world. And so we come to the mind. and we can identify three layers of the mind: the conscious, subconscious, and the unconscious. So right at the top, we've got the conscious mind, and that's our human brain. So that's the rational, that's the reasoning part of us. Then we have subconscious mind, and that's kind of our monkey brain or our mammalian brain. And that's running on emotions. It's a lot quicker. It works a lot faster than the human brain. Underneath it all is the unconscious mind, and we don't even know we're using it. And this, you might say, is our lizard brain or our autopilot. And look at the proportions. So the conscious, reasoning, rational part of you is only 10%. The emotions are a huge part. About half of your decisions and half of your behavior is driven by things you're not really thinking about. So the elephant in the room, and this is particular to New Zealand. So if you want to stand out, tall poppies tend to get mown down. And if you stand up and point out the oddities and the deviation from the norm, if you're the person pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, you'll likely be shouted down. And the final point is you've got to realize that most people are not ready to be unplugged. They are hopelessly dependent on the system, and they will they'll fight to protect it. And that's very true when you're dealing with difficult conversations, which is the topic of the next meeting. So the next time we meet in 2 weeks' time, we'll come back to how to have difficult conversations. That's our third and probably final part of our behavioural psychology. So just a quick look at the contents for that. We'll be looking at the 10 obstacles to people listening, the do's and don'ts for reaching people, a checklist for good conversation, and how we manage objections, and then how to make a well-structured claim.